Hello, everybody. Thank you so much to Ava and Andrea for interpretation today. And also just FYI for everybody, we will be recording today's session. So we will be distributing that afterwards for folks who were unable to join today, or if you want to be able to reference this afterwards. My name is Satara Gandhari. I'm the Advocacy Director at Detention Watch Network. And thank you guys so much for joining us today for this presentation on this joint project with Detention Watch Network, the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, and Ceres Policy Research. The report is called "If You Build It, ICE Will Fill It: The Link Between Detention Capacity and ICE Arrests." And I have to tell you all that this report has been a few years in the making now. We've been talking about it for a while, since I started at DWN. So we are so excited to be able to share this research with you now. As many of you know, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, operates the largest immigration detention center in the world, a system that is abusive, inhumane, and unnecessary. And actually, ICE not only detains people, but they're the agency that's also in charge of arresting people. And the more people they arrest, the more people they jail, and the more funding they demand. At DWN, we, along with our members and allies, have understood that a key in the fight to abolishing immigration detention is pushing for individual detention centers to shut down. Shutting down a detention center is not only a momentum-building win for the broader fight to abolish detention, but it has a real meaningful impact for the communities surrounding detention centers. And anecdotally, we have understood, and our communities have experienced, that where there's a nice detention center, people are at higher risk of arrest. And shutting down a facility has meant that communities also benefit from a lowered risk of arrest and detention. So this report explores data that confirms what we in our communities have known all along, and I'm so excited for all of you to hear more from our panel of speakers today. We have Mitzia Martinez, she's the research assistant at Ceres Policy Research. We have Gabriela Vieira, advocacy manager at Detention Watch Network. And I'm going to speak slower, apologies to our interpreters. And we also have Grisel Ruiz, supervising attorney at the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. We're going to hear from Mitzia a presentation on the research findings. Gabby is going to contextualize the findings in the current detention landscape for us, and Grisel will give us an overview of the recommendations that we have based on this report. We're going to have some time at the end for Q&A, but feel free, as your questions come up, to message me directly throughout the presentation, and I may pop in and mention them to our speakers as we go, but for the most part, I'll collect them, and we'll have a little bit of time for doing Q&A at the end. And so with that, I am going to pass it over to Mitzia.
Thank you so much. Could we get the slide on the methods, please? Yeah, so today I will be presenting on the presentation of findings and some of our steps that we took to, one, collect the data, second, to analyze the data at Ceres Policy Research. So we worked in collaboration with the Detention Watch Network and the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. And so they approached us at Ceres with an observation, right? They said they had observed and they had anecdotal evidence from folks on the ground, from advocates, from immigrants themselves, that when beds became available in local carceral facilities, or because a new facility was open, there seemed to be that ICE arrests seemed to follow. So while we know that cooperation with local enforcement and ICE increases ICE arrests, we kind of had a puzzle in which we thought, well, no research has been conducted about the relationship between the availability of detention beds and ICE enforcement practices. So that was our puzzle. So then we turned this puzzle with our conversations into a research question, which is what we do best at Ceres. And our research question was, are there higher rates of ICE arrest in certain regions where there are more immigration beds available? And we took on this process of trying to figure that out. Next slide, please. So for our methods, Dr. Angela Irvin and I became fellows at the Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse at Syracuse University. They're a small organization that provide immense data sets on ICE enforcement or ICE activity. And as part of our fellowship, we received access to data sets on ICE arrests, ICE removals, and ICE detention between the years of 2000 and 2018. Each data set had information on approximately 1 million people. And in total, our data sets contain information on over 2,600 counties. So when we think about research, we think about samples. So sampling, we want to take a sample and sort of generalize findings from that sample. But our data is actually a population. It's a really big representative population of almost all counties in the United States. So our findings in this report are very, very generalizable. So we used the data, we took 1 year out of the data, out of that data that we had available. So we used the data from 2017 to 2018 and organized the data by county. So we added how many arrests happened in each county during that time. We then constructed what we call variables for each county, where we determined the total amounts of prison beds in the county, the total amount of detention beds, the total arrest of immigrants in that county done by law enforcement. That is also part of the data. And we also discovered we also tried to test a variable called Trump supporters, where we tried to see if conservative sort of support aligns with ICE arrests in that data. If you have any questions about our methodology, actually our principal investigator at Ceres, Dr. Angela Irvine, is on this call. And we are also happy to set up a call with you outside of this webinar to talk to you about our methods. But I think Dr. Angela Irvine can put her email in the chat so you can reach us. We're happy to share our methods. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, that one, data analysis, thank you. So with these variables, we conducted what are called binary regression analysis. So these analyses allow us to see how the variables we constructed influence each other. So for example, how ICE arrests are influenced by the number of beds in a certain region. And this analysis allowed us to identify what we call tipping points, or a specific number of beds, for example, 50, that may increase a trend in arrests. So once we identified tipping points, we tested how different numbers of beds to see if they led to higher number of arrests with the regression analysis. And we share in the following slides what tipping points turned out to be statistically significant. Next slide, please. So our main finding in the research, as you know, that is part of this report, is that our research actually confirmed what community anecdotes, community advocates, and community representatives have been talking about, right? Is that our findings show that immigrants are actually more likely to be arrested and detained by ICE in counties with more detention beds. We are totally happy that the data backed up community narratives. Next slide, please. So this infographic is actually part of our report. So as I told you, we were able to match certain number of beds with a probability of an immigrant arrested. So here are our tipping points. Our tipping points became 50 beds, 200 beds, 450 beds, 650 beds, and 850 beds. So if a county has as little as 50 ICE detention beds available, immigrants in that county will be 2.3 times more likely to be arrested by ICE. However, if a county has as much as 850 ICE detention beds available or open, immigrants will be 6.4 times more likely to be arrested. So as you can see, the probability of arrest increases with the number of beds when the number of beds increases. But note that here we are only talking about the beds that are intentionally reserved for ICE detainees. However, in our data, what we saw was that counties with the highest numbers of apprehensions were actually really closely aligned with the locations of some of ICE's largest immigration facilities. So our data not only backs up community narratives, but it definitely matches the construction and the presence of ICE facilities and regions. Next slide, please. So we also found that the availability of regular criminal justice beds also impacts the probability of arrest for immigrants. So a secondary finding shows that immigrants are actually more likely to be arrested by ICE in counties with higher levels of jail and prison capacity. Next slide. So as you can see, for criminal justice beds, there were only 3 tipping points that were significant as opposed to ICE detention beds, which had more tipping points. So in counties with 850 criminal justice beds available, immigrants were 2.1 times more likely to be arrested. And that's a small number. Many counties have bed availability in the thousands. So that tells you how much vulnerability is compounded on immigrants when there is space in the criminal justice system available for them to fill. Next slide, thank you. So lastly, but just as important, our findings confirm that cross-system collaboration between ICE and police is especially threatening for immigrant people. So on top of being vulnerable based on the available bed space, immigrants are 4 times more likely to be arrested in counties with high levels of coordination between ICE and local enforcement. So our findings show a really strong relationship between the carceral bed space and ICE enforcement. They also illustrate that immigration and criminal justice systems are producing a compounded vulnerability for immigrants because the probability of arrest is heightened by multiple variables. And so what we know for sure from these findings and what we are so proud of reporting to you all is that if beds become available through decarceration efforts or because of the opening of a new facility in a certain region, chances are that ICE will definitely fill those beds.
Thank you so much, Mitsia. If folks have any questions on the findings, on the data, anything in that, anything there, please feel free to directly message me now and we'll try to get to them at the end. And yes, to the question in the chat, we are recording and will be sharing out the presentation afterward. I am now going to pass it over to Gabby to put this into some context for us.
Thanks, Atare, and thank you so much, Mitsia, and generally a huge thanks to Sarah's Policy Research for embarking on this project with us to prove what so many folks in the immigrant justice movement have been witnessing and documenting anecdotally for years. So what I want to do now is share a little bit about the why we felt it was crucial to have this evidence and what it means for our advocacy given the landscape of detention. So if we could go to the next slide. We can start off with the basics in terms of really defining ICE's detention capacity. So as of last week, there are 25,503 people in immigration detention, a number that is much higher than the size of the detention population inherited by the Biden administration, but also not indicative of ICE's actual overall capacity. While a number of factors have impacted ICE's detention levels over the last 2 or 3 years, ranging from the implementation of border policies that heavily restrict access to asylum and court orders that have limited population size and makeup under the COVID-19 pandemic, to movement organizing that has won release for many people previously detained. We all know that ICE's capacity for detention is actually much larger. ICE has contracts for approximately 200 detention facilities across the country, including for space in local jails and prisons, in addition to dedicated immigration detention centers. And many of these contracts actually also have guaranteed minimums baked into them, which are essentially quotas that require ICE to pay the locality or company operating the facility for a set number of beds, regardless of if they use them. And from 2017 to 2020, contracts with quotas increased by 38%. And this can deepen this incentive that we're already talking about for ICE to arrest people to fill empty beds. The last 2 years, the agency has also received funding from Congress to detain an average daily population that was actually thousands of people higher than the current population size. And they're currently funded to be detaining 34,000 people daily, even though they are still at this like 25,000 number. And since the agency's creation in 2003, its budget for enforcement and removal operations, which includes its budget for detention, has actually quadrupled. And we saw, what this could really look like before the pandemic. We saw ICE detention reach historic levels, hitting almost double what it is now, with more than 55,000 people in detention in the summer of 2019, which also is a year in which they deported over 250,000 people. And I will slow down, apologies. This is all to say that ICE's capacity and resources to detain and deport people is expansive. And that's what we were really looking at in this project and what our organizations try to tackle every day. And we've seen some wins and some losses under this administration, right? Since 2021, ICE has stopped detaining immigrants in over 10 facilities, including centers like the Irwin County Jail in Georgia, Bristol County Jail in Massachusetts, York County Prison in Pennsylvania, Etowah County Jail in Alabama, and all the county jails in New Jersey, Bergen, Essex, and Hudson County. All of these won by hard-fought local organizing, whether through the passage of state legislation or through other site fight campaigns that put enough pressure on the administration itself to end the use of some of these egregious facilities. However, the administration has also chased expansion efforts, particularly in the form of massive mega facilities, and mostly in the regions where we've seen closures, unfortunately. We've seen this pattern before. While under the Trump administration, we saw more of a broad reliance on a more decentralized network of contracts. Under the Obama administration before him, the inclination was that these larger, more concentrated facilities were, quote, better because they would allegedly allow for things like more intent oversight, et cetera. In addition to the fact that many of us know that abuse is endemic to the detention system, regardless of a facility size, our research again shows that neither approach is valid because it's the existence of a detention facility in itself that puts immigrants in danger. And the more capacity there is, whether concentrated or distributed, the greater the risk. And if we go to the next slide now, wanted to just give an example, a glaring example of this, the Moshannon Valley Correctional Center, which is a former Bureau of Prisons facility turned largest immigration detention center in the Northeast. ICE opened this facility up last year following a slew of closures in the region and the end of BOP's own contract with the private prison company that operated the facility and does now for ICE. Our friends at Juntos, who were leading the charge against the York County Prison that stopped detaining immigrants for ICE and are now devastatingly having to fight the new battle against Moshannon, shared this quote with us in regards to how they've seen this dynamic illustrated in our research play out locally. Though half the nearly 2,000 person facility is filled, ICE is actually still upping its enforcement activity in the area, presumably, and our research would corroborate, motivated by the almost 1,000 empty beds nearby. So according to the data, if we're looking at this, an undocumented immigrant in Clearfield County suddenly became over 6 times more vulnerable to an immigration arrest upon Moshannon opening its doors. Can we go to the next slide, please? Oh, and the next slide. Thank you. So detention closures have been opposed by some advocates in the past because of the possibility of folks detained at the closing facility being transferred away. This is a very real and serious concern that we name in our report needs to be integral to any closure strategy. But this data also reveals that even given that threat, many more immigrants will be less likely to be targeted because ICE will no longer be trying to fill beds in the area. And this can be a life preserver for some folks, for whom avoiding an ICE arrest and the ensuing detention is their only defense against deportation. As many of us know all too well, current immigration law is harsh and unforgiving. And once someone's arrested by ICE, many won't have a way to fight their deportation case. And so our evidence really shows that these site fights or these local campaigns to shut down facilities or block expansion are a key strategy to both keeping community members safe and throwing a wrench in ICE's enforcement machinery. Because arrests themselves are often violent and traumatic, with ICE regularly employing racist, militaristic, and at times unlawful tactics to tear them away from loved ones, from racial profiling to force and coercion. And once in detention, people also come face to face with rampant medical neglect, physical, sexual, and mental abuse, and a lack of basic necessities, among other abuses. And so while a closure makes immigrants in the immediate vicinity safer from being swept up into this cruel system, and it also protects others beyond the area from the abuse of yet another detention center. As a coworker of mine likes to say, one local facility can always simply be a transfer location for someone else. And in the broader scheme of things, this really tells us how immigration detention is the crux of ICE's deportation pipeline and a driving force behind enforcement activity patterns. And therefore, strategies to shrink and ultimately abolish immigration detention, whether through site fights or other tactics that Grisel will go into in a couple of minutes, when they're successful, severely restrict ICE's ability to carry out deportations. And if we go, great, thank you. Just the last thing I wanted to do before tossing it over to Grisel to talk about our recommendations is to reemphasize the data that Mitzi shared about how the risk for arrest is also increased in counties with higher overall carceral capacity and higher arrest rates by other law enforcement. This wasn't surprising to many of us and really confirms a long-standing understanding that immigration detention and enforcement is deeply entrenched within the broader prison industrial complex. We do see it in the daily operations of law enforcement that collaborate extensively with federal immigration agents. For example, ICE's contracts to use local jail and prison capacity for detention, and its cooperative programs like the 287G program that authorizes local and state police to carry out immigration arrests themselves. And meanwhile, local and state law enforcement are also gladly participating in this kind of collaboration. They frequently and voluntarily share databases and other information about incarcerated people, and also just transfer people directly from their custody to ICE. And we can even refer back to the Moshannon example again as a prime example. It's a former prison turned immigration detention center. It's not the first time we've seen a facility flip that way, and vice versa. And we're actually also going to be looking into that a little bit more and putting out more resources based on this research that kind of looks at that element more closely. But again, because these two systems are so entwined, and both so plagued by the same racialized policing and jailing practices, the impact is that immigrants of color are the most affected when detention centers bring elevated enforcement to a community, and in particular, Black immigrants. So it's a fresh reminder that these struggles for liberation are aligned, and that if we're committed to immigrant justice and racial justice, we need to be thinking about the broader infrastructure of mass incarceration, because these systems and the harms that they cause our communities are inextricable and will therefore actually need to be tackled together. And with that, I will toss it over to Grisel to tell us more about what all of this looks like in practice.
Thank you so much, Gabby and Mitsia, for providing such a thorough review of how we came to these findings and how these findings fit in the broader movement. I'm now going to move us into the recommendations portion of the report. So essentially, how can we turn everything that we've learned into action? What are some specific asks that we have with different targets? So starting with the federal government. And this is something we're revisiting right here in California after the courts just recently announced that our private prison ban will be struck down. And for context, this was a legal attack started by the Trump administration, but carried on by Biden. And yet we realize that this harm isn't unique to California. The Biden administration has obviously been complicit in keeping cages open nationwide, even as detention numbers started to dip significantly during the pandemic. And so in these moments, we're reminded that we do have one answer in front of us right now. Biden has the discretion to course correct and cut the contracts right now. You need proof. The administration has ended ICE detention at 3 county jails in the last year. And so one collective demand that we can make is for the Biden administration to cut the contracts. And one thing I've learned through these years of waging these detention fights is that it's so important to think multiple steps ahead. And so making it clear with all of our demands that it's not enough to just close the cages. That's not our end goal. We don't want these cages to be replaced by other cages or by electronic monitoring. We want Biden to cut these contracts so our communities can be free. And for our opponents who need a roadmap, GWN's Communities Not Cages provides a roadmap for closures by uplifting all of the site fights across the nation, which I know taps a lot of the people who are on today's webinar. Next slide, please. And again, one thing we've learned through advocacy is that it's not enough to just say close the cages. We really need to keep the entire picture in mind. And another part of this is not just dismantling detention, but also defunding it. So one thing I always think about is you can really tell a person's values by how they spend their time and how they spend their money. They can say whatever they want to say, but how they spend their time and money is really a reflection of what they care about. And when we look at how the federal government spends its money, we actually learn quite a lot. So it turns out that about $25 billion of our tax money is spent each year on ICE and CBP. And this money translates into funding the detention of immigrants, militarizing our borders, and as we've seen, the racially motivated arrests of immigrants in our communities and at the border. So can you imagine what our communities could do with $25 billion if that were instead invested in things like education, healthcare, affordable housing, or so many other safety nets we've seen are actually proven to keep our community stable and safe. So this is what the Defund Hate campaign is about. It's about peeling back the curtain so that people can see what's happening with our tax dollars. It's about challenging the budget process, disrupting the appropriations process, which is part of that approval process to get those funds, and holding members of Congress accountable because they are the ones who are holding the purse strings and deciding how these funds are spent. This is also an important part of framing how we collectively look at the problem of detention and deportation. Again, it's not just about closing cages. That isn't the end goal. We want to divest entirely from the system. We want to defund these systems so that these resources can instead be invested directly in our communities. And for more about this campaign generally, you'll see a link below, which has some resources in both English and Spanish. That's defundhatenow.org. Next slide. So when we fight to close detention facilities, oh, perfect, thank you. We know that a common pushback is, what about local economies? What about local jobs? When we were fighting to stop the addition of new detention facilities in California, this was actually the lead point that was being brought by our opposition. So to start off, it is a valid talking point. It is a valid point that we should question the validity of any job that hinges on the suffering of others. Even so, we do want to go farther. And the federal government has a role to play here. And I think state and local governments have a role to play here as well. So this is something that can be applied to them as well. So as the federal government saves money by, for example, divesting from DHS, cutting contracts, because those contracts run in the tunes of millions and billions of dollars, the federal government can use any cost savings to create a Just Transitions Economic Development Fund. So what does this mean? Just transition is a term coined by labor unions and environmental activists who saw the need to phase out harmful industries and phase in jobs that are healthier for our communities and our planet. Oh, and pardon, I will slow down. In the detention context, the feds could set money aside to provide mini grants to local communities transitioning away from carceral economies so that communities can shift to more sustainable industries. So things like green jobs, for example. And again, remember, we always want to think multiple steps ahead with our demands. So any fund that is set up needs to be guided by an advisory committee, including economic advisors, yes, of course, but also formerly incarcerated people, community leaders, and other local stakeholders. So again, always thinking multiple steps ahead, because if not, our opponents will take a hold of any power that's available. Hi. And don't worry, we have demands for those working outside of DC also. So for local cities and counties and states, one thing that we've seen time and time again, regrettably, is that all of these actors routinely prop up the detention and deportation system. So they do this, for example, when local jails and state prisons cooperate with ICE by routinely helping ICE arrest people in their custody. And importantly, this is not something they're required to do. They do it voluntarily. They generally do it without any funding, and they're free to stop at any point. And also arrests in our criminal system, that's actually the #1 source of ICE arrests in the interior. So this is a really critical juncture where advocacy can happen. And we do actually have a map on ILRC's website. You'll see our link in the bottom left-hand corner, where we map out successful campaigns that we've had across the country, both locally and statewide. So there are examples of success. Another way that our government props up the detention system specifically is by helping ICE and private prisons set up immigration detention contracts. So for example, some cities contract with ICE to detain immigrants and then turn right around and contract with a private prison company to actually detain the individuals. So the city acts as a middleman, gets paid off, and ICE and the private prison company end up with contracts that were set up more quickly and more secretly. And the same happens with county jails. Some county jails will set up a contract with ICE to essentially house people both in the criminal system and also in the immigration system. So what can we do? One thing is that we can ask our cities not to be complicit in these contracts, whether they're contracting to house people in the criminal system or setting up these private contracts. They need to get out of that system. They need to get out of that business. And for a local city or county who hasn't yet done that, one thing you can do is ask for a commitment that they won't ever enter into those contracts to begin with. So thinking ahead and fighting proactively. And we should also be fighting for policies commonly referred to as sanctuary policies, where jails and prisons basically requesting that your local sheriff or state prison system not cooperate with ICE, so that, again, our community members aren't funneled into the detention and deportation system to begin with. And again, we have a slew of free resources on our website if you're interested in waging a campaign around sanctuary policies. Next slide. And finally, we have recommendations for advocates and allies as well. The first is to support closure campaigns. As Gabby was describing, we know that our communities can be divided when advocates disagree about closure, and we know that there is a lot of validity in these concerns as well. At the same time, we are all weaker when we're divided, and I think that this report provides a lot of additional points that really need to be considered and really lead to the conclusion that it's crucial to support closure fights. So this report highlights an important truth, that the existence of a detention center brings more ICE arrests to a community, and the inverse is also true. Immigrant communities are safer when a detention facility shuts down. And again, as Gabby described, for some people, avoiding an ICE arrest is the only defense that they have to deportation, because the immigration system leaves such few forms of relief available for so many people. In other words, there are a lot of people who are detained and don't have a valid way to fight their case. So avoiding this arrest to begin with is the primary defense for a lot of people, unfortunately. It's also important for us to fight for the reality we want to see. We want a world where we close cages and divest from them and instead invest in our communities. And that reality is in conflict when we're also dealing with a carceral state that's deepening its roots day by day and expanding. And it's also important to remember that none of us are working in silos. I mean, even if you look at how many people there are on today's webinar across the nation, this really reminds us that this is a national movement, and it's a national movement with momentum. Advocates across the US have passed or introduced anti-detention laws at the state level. Communities locally are setting the groundwork by waging site fight campaigns. And shifting gears a little bit for another important ask. When fighting for closures, we also want to ensure that we are demanding that our communities are freed and not transferred to another facility. And there are some best practices that we can pull from other facilities that have already closed across the nation. And our final recommendation is really to stand in solidarity and show up for the fights that are being waged by our allies in the criminal system. So it is so important that we stand in solidarity with those allies, because our struggles are tied and our liberation is tied as well. And we've seen cages closed for one purpose, only to be flipped to be used to house a different set of our community members. So, you know, same facility, now just detaining a different set of Black and brown bodies. And that's obviously not where we want to end up. And because of that, it's so important for us to collectively fight to close cages for all purposes. So even when we're fighting to close an immigration detention facility, thinking 2 steps ahead and thinking, okay, how can we ensure that this facility isn't just reopened for the criminal system, for example? If you're curious about additional data points or recommendations, we do have a report coming out on that issue as well. And with that, I am done with our section. We have about 15 minutes for Q&A. Please feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat box. We will stay on for the remainder of the hour to answer any questions that any of you have. And we really thank you for your time today. We know that this is a marathon, it's not a sprint, and we really do think that collectively we can meet our goal.
Thank you so much, Grizel and Gabby and Mitsia. There were a few questions that came through on the chat as you all were talking, and some of them are more data centered. So I was going to ask those before Mitsia has to leave us, and then if there are other questions that get populated. I think the best, since there's so many of us on the call, I think the best thing to do is to try to drop your questions into the chat and then I can read them out. And I also just wanted to thank everyone for staying on mute the whole time. We didn't give that reminder, but everyone is so used to Zoom. We don't need to do that anymore. So the first question around data is whether there were any specific factors on, like, whether the arrest, like if someone was stopped for, well, let's see. Let me just read the question actually and see if you can answer it. Were there any specific factors about those arrested that might increase the tipping point, like increase the risk of them going into ICE custody? For example, if the arrests were based on certain types of stops, or if people were being transferred more through jail or prison, if they had certain types of criminal legal history. Were you able to look at all at the reasons behind the arrests?
Yeah, I can answer that really quickly. And Angela, feel free to add anything to my response. We didn't create a variable that tested whether different crimes or different reasons for arrest or a stop created sort of an increase in arrest. The only variable that we created was kind of like if an immigrant was arrested not by ICE but by a law enforcement officer, like a local law enforcement officer, whether that would increase the probability of arrest. So we actually don't know whether there are certain factors about the stop that can increase the probability of arrest for this particular report. But what we did see was that the majority of kind of offenses that folks were either committing or arrested for were nonviolent. But that's all that we know about that data. Angela, do you have anything to add?
No, we could have done that analysis, but we didn't. The data was definitely there. And I, just to punctuate what Mitzi has said, we saw that most of the charges were nonviolent.
Another question around the data is whether you all did any specific look specifically at enforcement within the 100-mile zone of the border, if you looked at that specifically, and also if you could explain a little bit more around the variable you talked about with Trump voters and what you found there.
Yeah, so Angela, again, feel free to jump in, but we didn't create a variable again that was like, that only tested the folks within the 100 miles from the border. However, a lot of our data was from counties that were 100 miles from the border, if not really close. So a lot of our Texas data was really intertwined with the location that was close to the border. And for Trump percentage, we just wanted to see in series whether, conservative thought, conservative political affiliation, whether a county that is maybe 90% Trump voters, whether that had anything to do with ICE enforcement. However, Angela, let me know if anything was statistically significant.
So what we did find is that before we were testing the tipping points, that the counties that had more than 75% Trump voters were more likely to lead to arrests, but the tipping points of how many beds were available essentially overrode the Trump voters. So our initial explorations showed that variable was significant, but then it became insignificant. I think further analysis or further exploration would, I think that probably there's a correlation, right, between conservative thought and how many beds are available. And it's just that the beds became more explanatory. So thank you.
And one more question on data before we move on to the other questions. There's a question here around how you calculated detention capacity. Did you have information on the capacity for each facility, or did you estimate it somehow?
So we organized, so our data sets had both number of arrests, and it also had the names of the facilities where folks were put in. So that was the longest part of our research. I went on a, how do I call it, an online search for looking for capacity. Sometimes a lot of these counties and facilities have their capacity online because they're really proud to announce that their capacity has increased or that they hold this many people, they have this many beds. So it was really easy to find the capacity online of facilities and also add them up per county. Other times I would make calls and people were happy to give me that information. So it was about getting really strategic, not only estimating when there was contradicting data, but also being able to not only look online, but also call people to double check for the capacity. So yeah, there was a little bit of estimation, but also really, really concrete answers from the workers themselves and county officials themselves.
Thank you. Lots of data questions. There's a lot of really rich stuff here. So let's see. We have a few other questions here. Someone mentioned here so I wanted to point Gabby and Grisel to Zach's question here about when facilities close, how that impacts like increased detention in other facilities. Have you seen facility closures impact the number of arrests that happen in the county or region where there's let me see, I'm misreading this question. I think the question is around when new facilities open, do we see an increase in the number of arrests in that county or region? Gabby, I think you touched a little bit on this when you were talking about Moshannon.
Yeah, I think, let me make sure I'm understanding the question. Right. I think what I was naming was a pattern where we have been under the Biden administration seeing some closures, but unfortunately in those same broader regions, and this goes a little bit more broadly than like the county specific data that we have, we've seen these mega facilities open up, which obviously, like we said, impacts the immediate vicinity, which is, what we were detailing with that example and what this research actually details. But unfortunately, we do see, when these mega facilities open up, the need to fill beds. We didn't, expand our research to beyond the county line, but I can be sure from anecdotal evidence we can share that even beyond those lines, we see ICE looking to fill beds in a region, right? So we're seeing folks from other states in the same like regional space being sent to those facilities as well to fill those beds. And the number, have you seen the impact of the number of arrests that happen? Yeah, so I haven't like compared. Yeah, we don't have like a specific like county by county arrests or like regional wide arrest numbers. But we do see, oftentimes that's the pattern that we kind of see.
Thanks, Gabby. I think there's a lot of questions here that are similar in that similar vein. And I think we would be happy to have more conversations too offline about some of that. So if you still have questions about that, definitely feel free to get in touch with any of us on the call. Let's see, I think we might have time for one more question, one or two. I'm gonna try to pick one. There's a few here. Yes, and thank you so much, Mitsia, for being on. Mitsia has to step out, but Angela's still here to answer any more data questions for us. I think there's a question here about data on when there have been detention center closures, whether we've been successful at getting releases versus transfers and the percentages there. Gabby or Grisel, feel free to jump in here. I can just answer quickly that, this report doesn't look into that. I think there may be some folks on Detention Watch Network staff that may have some information on specific detention center closures that we would be happy to follow up with you, after the call, but we do not have, that's not really explored in the report. But I think Gabby also got a similar question around transfers that I'm going to toss it over to you to answer, Gabby.
Yeah, sorry, I got one privately and I'm trying to find it right now, but I think the question was kind of around whether a discussion of whether, the threat of, or the decreased targeting and decreased arrests outweighs the threats of transfers. And I just want to, talk about that and welcome Grisel to jump in here too. As I know that ILRC, also this is like conversations that y'all have locally as well. But it's not really, about one outweighing the other necessarily, but about a few, different pieces. One, that it's kind of a false ultimatum, right? ICE has the discretion to release anyone at any time. And using transfers as a threat against facility closures is actually a active tactic to repress the momentum of site fights. And it's been really inspiring, I want to say, to see how campaigns have refused to accept that and learn to really integrate the fight against transfers into closure fights and processes, like Grisel mentioned, and like we've seen in a lot of locations where facilities have closed and folks have had to deal with those threats. And at the end of the day, we know that transfers, unfortunately, are still going to happen. They happen regularly, even without closures. But just, looking at it from even overhead, the more closures we achieve, the less facilities there will be for people to be transferred to. Like I said, a local facility for one person is a transfer location for someone else. But at the end of the day, the less people that are targeted, the less people ICE detains, the more we can restrict ICE's ability to deport folks. And I don't know.
And I think I'll be echoing a lot of what Gabby says. It really is a false narrative that's put upon us by ICE. When we've been pushing for legislation in California, ICE would actually release they actually release op-eds and different press statements saying, oh, we're being forced to detain people. And our response was, no, you're choosing to detain people and you're pitting us against each other. So I think that's actually really important because, they are setting us up they're trying to divide us. And that's a very clear intent on their part. When they said at the same time, oh, and it's actually going to be harder for us to detain people if we have fewer facilities. So also kind of showing what we actually know is true, that the more facilities they have, the more people they are going to arrest. And there are some examples of some closures that have happened in California, for example, and I know in other places as well. And just in terms of models, in terms of just concentrating legal resources, trying to get people released, trying to get people transferred back, pushing for universal rep funding that follows the individual, so that allows representation even if the person is transferred out. And like Gabby has said, we've had transfers before any of us, before any of these state laws were successful, while we were still fighting for local closures. So this is something that has always existed. So again, very important to not allow ICE to control the narrative, but for us to take a hold of it.
Exactly. Thank you so much to everybody who was on this call today. We're at 3:00, so I know that there are a lot of questions still, which is so wonderful. And this has been such a great dialogue. And, again, we encourage folks to reach out to any of the speakers on today's call to, talk more about what's in the report and sort of what's next. I did want to uplift a resource that was just shared in our chat that has more resources on releases, not transfers, and how, has some examples and ideas for how you can push for that in your local site fights. So definitely check out that resource and be on the lookout for our next report on the recycling of jails. And thanks everyone so much for joining us, and looking forward to continuing these conversations with all of you and eventually abolishing ICE detention. Thanks everybody.